I agreed with my son that it was strange his coach was monitoring their private messages. My son is 15 and plays on a competitive travel soccer team. He's been on it for about a year now, and overall, it's been a good experience. One of his closest teammates is a kid named Evan. They text constantly about practices, homework, video games, normal teenage stuff. Evan's dad, Mark, is also one of the assistant coaches. I knew he was pretty intense, but I figured that came with the territory. A few months ago, my son casually mentioned that Evan's dad sometimes reads their group chat. I didn't love that, but I also know some parents monitor their kids' phones. I didn't think much of it until my son added, "Sometimes he replies." That made me pause. I asked what he meant, and my son said Mark will answer messages pretending to be Evan. Stuff like, "Can't talk now," or "Focus on practice." Nothing outright cruel, just odd. I told my son to keep it in mind but didn't escalate it. It wasn't my kid, and I didn't want to start drama. Then last week my phone rang while I was unloading groceries. It was Mark, and he sounded irritated right out of the gate. He said my son was being disrespectful and sarcastic in messages, and that I needed to rein him in. I was genuinely confused. I asked what he was talking about. He said my son was giving attitude in the team chat. I asked why he was reading the kids' private messages in the first place. That's when his tone really changed. He said as a coach and a parent, he had every right. I told him I'd look into it and hung up. I went straight to my son and asked him what happened. He didn't argue or get defensive. He just handed me his phone. I read through the messages. My son had asked Evan if he wanted to stay late after practice to work on drills. Evan replied that he was busy. My son asked when he'd be free. Then the response came back, "Stop pushing. He'll talk when he's ready." My son replied, "Why are you answering for him? That's weird." Mark responded that he was protecting his son. My son replied, "This is a private chat, not a team meeting." That was it. I sat my son down and told him he shouldn't escalate things with adults, even when he's frustrated. I also told him next time, if he realizes it's not Evan texting, just disengage. He understood immediately. He wasn't defensive or rude about it. He just nodded and said, "Okay, that makes sense." I called Mark back and told him I spoke to my son and it was handled. That wasn't good enough for him. He said I should be checking my son's phone more often and monitoring who he talks to. Then he started listing things he'd seen in the chats. Complaints about conditioning drills, jokes about the assistant coaches, frustration about missed playing time. He said my son had even vented about him specifically. I told him that teenagers vent, that talking to friends is normal. I said I'd be more concerned if my son didn't feel safe expressing frustration privately. Mark didn't like that answer. He wanted to know what consequences my son would face. I said there weren't any beyond the conversation we already had. That's when he raised his voice and said my son had disrespected a coach. I told him calmly that my son pointed out something that was strange, and he wasn't wrong. There was silence on the line. Then Mark said maybe it was best if our sons took a break from hanging out. He hung up before I could respond. Later that evening, Evan's mom texted me. She was polite but distant, saying things were tense at home and they thought space was best. I replied that I respected their decision, but my son hadn't done anything inappropriate. She didn't respond. The next day, my son came home quieter than usual. He said Evan barely spoke to him at practice and sat with different kids afterward. When I asked what Evan thought, my son said, he said his dad doesn't want him texting me anymore. I asked how that made him feel. He shrugged and said, "I guess I lost a friend because I noticed something was off." I told him he didn't do anything wrong.